of fish protein. The market for that in the developed world is very low. It's not a native, it's not a wild species, it's a cross. It's not a local species in the hundreds of places where these strains have now been introduced to help deal with local hunger problems. The parts of the world where you use pond aquaculture to augment small-scale agriculture are almost all parts of the world where seasonal rainfall, monsoons or whatever, will periodically lead to flooding. You have to assume that these strains of fish will be released into the wild, and the solution to the hunger problem, we don't know how much protein can be produced by these small-scale integrated farming aquaculture facilities, but it's extremely promising. It may well be a big part of the solution, but there are ecosystem biodiversity risks associated with it, and the effort to have local herbivorous strains of local species found for all the parts of the world where you need it. The science capacity to do that work doesn't exist. We could make that a priority, have large efforts put to find a native strain local to each area that is herbivorous, does grow quickly, and can eat off small-scale agricultural waste. Very promising pathway, but it would involve putting a lot of research effort into this activity, which so far has been dealt with by finding a good strain and then disseminating it widely across the planet as a much more cost-effective way to get this form of protein production entrenched. And they take the biodiversity risk that these will be such specialized species that strains that they will not do well in the wild in competition with native species. But we've learned the hard way that that's not a good risk to take. But tens, scores of millions of metric tons of protein could possibly be produced by this form of integrated agriculture, aquaculture, of lower, herbivorous fish, no question.
I've been asked by the Spina Simon, our coordinator, to tell you that we have booked lunch for you. So at the end of this meeting at 1, there should be lunch there. So just in case you are thinking about leaving early, please and find good questions at the lunchtime. So,
I'm just wondering whether you've looked at the sort of price incentives that are going on in some of the aquaculture industry. It's just interesting that certainly in New Zealand and elsewhere, which I've looked at the aquaculture, that basically the industry is moving away from using fish as fish meal and fish oil. They're reducing the quantity of fish meal and fish oil and replacing it with soy and other products. And the main incentive for that is price. So there's a driver there which I don't know whether you've looked at in your calculations. It seems like you're making a sort of arbitrary thing saying that you need fish as an alternative when there are other things that you get protein from rather than just fish. And that the impacts, for example, in the Pacific is actually of distant water fishing nations or in West Africa, distant water fishing nations over-exploiting fish stocks which were important for local communities, and or in fact more recently off Western South America. So I think it's the Western nations or distant water fishing nations which have a lot to blame in terms of the problems that they've created in terms of the impacts on fisheries. And without looking at that in the equation in terms of the failures of both fisheries management agencies and also local countries' fisheries agencies in terms of managing fisheries, that needs to be looked at in the equation if you're talking about protein generally.
Certainly the talk that we put together here did not get into the very complex issues of the equity of distribution of food on the planet. This is not a unique problem for fish products. We can all read many sources which say there is no problem with producing food on the planet. There's plenty of food that everyone's needs can be met. There's no excuse for hunger, except we have an inequity of distribution of food that resembles the inequity of distribution of everything else on the planet. And I don't know of anyone who's come up with a way to deal with the inequities that go with a globalized economy. Solving that problem will contribute to dealing with world hunger, just as much as it will contribute to dealing with poverty and a whole lot of other human issues. But that, I think, is beyond the scope of fisheries management to deal with globalized economy. We can't ignore it, but there isn't a solution out there unique to fisheries that isn't going to go way beyond the challenges we face. The point about alternative food sources for aquaculture, absolutely. But this, in all the countries that are doing it, it's not only a matter of finding, yes, there's soy sources and things like that. Those soybeans could just as readily be fed directly. They're a very good protein source for people without having to cycle them through fish in order to be consumed. It changes the nature of the discussion, but it doesn't change the fundamental things that need to be talked about in terms of what is the best way to deal with feeding the planet. And dealing with these food supplies in the countries I know of, most of them in the north, that are dealing with it, simultaneous with looking at different diets for fish kept in captivity, are different strains of fish kept in captivity and frankenfish. Genetically modified fish do much better in aquaculture. You get better growth, you get better yield per unit of food, you get higher survivorship. And this is another complex social discussion about the fact that an easy contributor to dealing with global hunger is genetically modified foods. There's a whole bunch of biodiversity issues there that need a forum for discussion.
The debate on food security is too big for this room. It's very complex, but it's fascinating and very important. More questions?
I would like to hear your, if you can make a few remarks about wild stock enhancement initiatives. Do you see this as some kind of a solution? Do you see more risks? Talking about all kinds of initiatives to, for example, grow on farms stocks and then enhancing back into wild fisheries, not into agriculture.
Capture-based culture.
Canada spent probably hundreds of millions of dollars over a 20-year period on salmon enhancement, building hatcheries to grow salmon to release into the wild, to come back and be caught. You will not find any official policy statement saying it was a failure. But without question, hatcheries are being closed down, investments in salmon enhancement are being scaled way back. For depleted stocks, there are lots of strategies where culture facilities can contribute to recovery. But to increase productivity of a stock once it is at historical levels, the evidence that you can somehow increase the carrying capacity of the ocean by putting out more young fish is really weak, easy to challenge. And that gets back to the other point I was thinking of with regard to the stocks that are depleted. I haven't seen any estimate of total wild stock production if management managed to rebuild all the depleted stocks that exceeds the neighborhood of 110 to 120 million metric tons. I've never seen even the most optimistic fanatic say, if we undo all the damage done to fish stocks over the last 100 years, we'll get sustainable harvests of 150 to 200 million tons a year from wild stocks, even enhanced wild stocks. There's a cap, and for planning purposes, call it 120 million. And that still leaves a deficit of 50 to 70 million tons from culture facilities as the only real option.
Just to continue on this little point here, in this estimate there is always two major unknown or things we have on the side that we don't look at. One is squids. It has always been said in the early 70s that there are at least 100 million tons of squids out there to be caught. At least that was the idea at that time. And probably 100 or 200 million tons of deep sea scattering layered little things that we are supposed to be eating. But all of these are forage species, and therefore you always have the second sentence, yes, they seem to be there, very high productivity, but what are we supposed to do with their things? Are we supposed to touch them or not? So the sort of resources in which there could be some more catch to get are resources which are sensitive from the ecological point of view. So we are back to the square one that Jake was underlining before.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Kennedy Ron from Environment Liaison Center International. Now, thank you for the presentations and the discussions that have already followed. The statistics that you have showed us there show that the population of the fisheries compared to that of the consumers, there seems to be actually an inverse correlation there, which means demand is going to increase and the pressure is going to be much more on the fishery sector. The question I have relates to the communities that directly depend on the resource for food security, and not just food security, but the entire livelihoods. As this demand increases, there is a market structure that is also emerging that supports that high level, often international and the most affluent national level markets. This structure leaves out the communities that depend on this resource. I wonder whether we can throw in some thoughts that can help protect these people. I know you've mentioned that food security is a little higher objective that we may not discuss adequately here, but at least with reference to the communities that depend on this resource. I'm thinking also about the role of these communities that depend on the resource with regard to management of the same resource. You realize that IUCN here is talking about conservation, management, perhaps other organizations like Sao Tome and now my organization ELC, we talk about conservation, but we are not necessarily the communities that depend on the resource. What is the role that the communities that these communities can take to actively be part of the management of the resource? And at the same time, I don't know, probably when you'll be addressing the first question about markets, governments, the local governments have an active role to play. They have actually a responsibility to ensure food security for these communities because they do not know alternatives unless we are going to start pointing them in other directions, which will also take a lot of time, but it's a good thing to do because diversity increases their security in terms of food security and livelihood. So some thoughts on those lines, please.
concerns you probably have.
Well, if I understand well your questions, one is really the impact that the market is going to have, and it's obvious, as we have seen in the trends in the last 20 years, that the market flows have gone from inside to outside. So a lot of the fish is now going outside. And this has started long ago, because I still remember reading a paper that explained how along the coast of Mauritania, Senegal, etc., the fish was being salted with fish coming from, salt coming from Chad, and the salted fish was going back to Chad through camels. And before the arrival of the colonial powers, the trade of the fish was inside, not getting outside. And as soon as colonization came in, the trade fluxes were balanced the other way around and started going to the developed countries. And it's obvious that the demand of fish now goes to who can pay the highest price. And if the people from inside can't pay as much as the market price, the global market price, then the fish tends to get out. And fish is the most internationally traded good. It's much more internationally traded than any other good on earth, except oil, perhaps oil. So there is a risk, and it's not a risk, it's a reality, that many coastal populations will have less and less fish to eat. If the world continues to develop, and as Jake said, if the polarization created by globalization continues, because they won't be able to afford that fish. That's a real risk, which means, to add to what you were saying before, that even if we could produce the 75,000 million tons needed, that doesn't guarantee that the poor communities will have their food security ensured. If that was your concern, I agree that this is a very high risk. I'm not sure what the solution is, but I agree. I was in Tunisia 30 years ago when it was prohibited by law to export fish from Tunisia. And on the market, you could see fish as big as that available at a very low price to people. Then the government decided to change the law and export to Greece, Italy, etc. I went there 2 years later, and in the market there was only very small fish like that at high price. So they had a direct market. You had something else in your question?
Local governments can play a role in bringing in policies like the one in these areas.
But yeah, one problem we didn't mention before, of course, that is there in the background, is that if you have all these foreign fleets taking fish out, and if you have foreign markets taking fish out, there are some reasons behind. And the key reason usually that the state in question has to pay its energy bill, and it needs foreign currency. That's the key problem. And I know many problems when which the fish is sold out because you need foreign currency. If you don't have the foreign currency, you have to shut out your lights. And so it's a real issue that many countries only have fish resources that can be exported. I heard recently about a country which I will not nominate, in which oil has been found in great quantity. Before finding the oil, that country was very, very adamant at looking carefully at its resources and managing the impact of the foreign fleets and looking at the interest of the small-scale fishermen, etc. They were doing that quite well. Since they found oil, the locals told me, we thought, oh, now that we have oil, we are going to be able to be tougher even on fisheries, and manage that better. And they said we got exactly the opposite. Now that the government has the oil money, they really don't care about the fisheries anymore because they have oil. And so they don't have to optimize the fisheries. So there, again, the market and the foreign fleets probably will take a bit more out of the system. The role in conservation and management, I think that was said before. I don't know if it's in this meeting or the one we just had. I got mixed up. But there is a general tendency both in conservation and in fisheries to say that the people must be more and more involved. So the concept of participation, of local support, etc., is there in all the official rhetorics. It's there. Whether that in the end is to the benefit or not to the people, it depends usually on local conditions. There are situations in which governments have devolved a lot of authority to the communities. Satoumi is a very good example, but there are many others. But in the end, whether the result is in favor of the people that have been involved or not, depends on the system. There are many areas, for instance, where the authority has been delegated to the local people, and when the system became completely democratic in a way, what happened is, because the revenue of tourism was much higher than the revenue of fisheries, all the revenues went to tourism, and from there they flew to the capital. and no more revenues were left locally, despite the fact that it was a locally driven mechanism, because the local community is not as homogeneous as you think, and that flow can still happen. One question I had for you, Makino-san, was when we have systems that are local community based like that, how do they deal with global drivers? Because in fisheries, a lot of what happens locally depends on global drivers. So how can the local community governance system deal with global drivers? How do you deal with that in Japan?
Well, there are many global drivers like the price or global climate change, but if I talk about the price, yes, actually there are heavy influences to even the very remote local communities. But one thing is that coastal communities are catching high price fresh fish for eating fresh, like sashimi. But the imported fish are mainly frozen, and the average price is quite lower than the live fish consumed in. So in that sense, the market is separated. But of course, many local communities are against the free trade, especially the food